So thank you very much for that welcome here. We are very excited to be here. I think we kind of went back and forth on like kind of our style, but we're just going to be ourselves and really be transparent with what we're doing in Minneapolis and how we're doing things differently.
So as Grant said, I'm Michael Walker, the new director for the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. It's brand spanking new. It basically August 1st of 2014 is when it opened and when I started on the work. And before that, he said I was an assistant principal at Roosevelt High School. I was also a dean of students at Roosevelt, as well as working in the Career and College Center at Roosevelt High School. But before that, I worked for the YMCA for about 10 years, working with young people as well, specifically black males, to support them in their progress to become better citizens and productive members of society. So that's kind of our information. Now, I have to be transparent. I'm out of business cards, so if you want to contact me, you might want to jot this information down right now. So just so you guys know, I'm out of business cards.
I think you might have done that so you won't ask questions, but we'll see later. You want to go back? Did you need to? Okay. I'm Robin Francis. I am the principal on special assignment for behavior standards. I am very new to Minneapolis. July 1st is when I began. I came from a background of teaching. I was a second grade teacher for a while. I was an administrator in the South Washington School District for a while, about 10 years, ranging from elementary school principal to an assistant principal at the secondary level. And all along, as I had gone through my kind of career, my journey in education, the issues that are plaguing Minneapolis, or the issues that are plaguing us nationally, I thought it was very unique that Minneapolis wanted to call this out and move forward and deal with it. So when I first was hired for the positions, that was one of my questions I was asked. Well, why do you want this big body of work? Why do you want to do this? Because I feel like we can't keep doing the same thing the same way. We need to do something different. And so these offices are an example of that.
So hopefully today we'll be able to answer these questions. So these are commonly questions that we get when we go out and talk about our offices, or if we're out meeting different people. They ask these basic questions. Why were the offices created?
What are behavior standards? What does that mean? What's a behavior standards policy?
What is restorative practices? So we'll answer that question.
And what are you going to do differently? And I think one example of that just so far within the presentation is the offices themselves.
And then the last one, how will you authentically engage key stakeholders? And so hopefully we'll answer those questions. If we don't answer those questions, at the end you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions of us, and we'll hopefully have an answer for you at that time if we don't cover it during the presentation. All right, so the why. Back in, I want to say June, there was a statement up on our website for Minneapolis Public Schools, and it's up here. It says, we have an opportunity to reduce chronic absenteeism, remedy the disproportionate suspensions and expulsions, raise graduation rates, improve academic performance, and increase the number of black male students in advanced placement and honors classes. That's what we're here to do. That's what our offices are created for. That's what our offices are designed to do, is to change the trajectory for our young black males currently in Minneapolis public school system. So that's what our charge is on a daily basis. That's what we focus on.
And initially we weren't working together. We were kind of two separate silos, kind of doing our own thing, kind of plugging away at this huge body of work. So how do the Office of Behavior Standards and Office of Black Male Student Achievement, how can we work together? We started looking at 3 key areas that we could really do the work together. The area of professional development. We've started aligning our professional development to make sure that we're starting in those classrooms with instruction and tools for our teachers. Community meetings. It's funny because we've been doing all these different separate meetings, and I don't know if you want to speak to this one.
We'll do it later.
Okay. And then, so in regard to community meetings and how we're going to engage our parents differently, and that'll come up later, as he said. And then best practice. What do our teachers need to be effective in the classroom for all of our students? What does that look like? So this is a slide that shows last year's our suspension rate as compared to this year. Yep, we're making differences. We are cutting our suspensions almost in half for our African American male. But there's still a lot of work to be done. Now we need to look at that disproportionality. What's at the cause of, oh, I don't talk loud enough? Okay. What's at the cause of that disproportionality, and why? And how can we support, give our teachers tools to work with each of our students? So just to point out, that 7.91% was last year, and this year would be the 3.68. That's where we're sitting. So we have done some work, but now we have more work to do.
And kind of going back to the previous slide before the data slide, we were talking about how our offices kind of came together. You started in Minneapolis July 1st, and I started August 1st. So we were a month apart, right, starting our offices. And so she was going down her track, and I was going down my separate track, trying to figure out what are we going to do with these young black men, and how do I support them in the work that I'm going to be doing. And so I had never really connected with Robin Francis' work until about, I want to say it was September. We were at a meeting, and I'll give her credit. She said, hey, you're going out to meet with some young black men. I want to come and ask their experience about their discipline practices in Minneapolis public schools. And so that was kind of our first interaction with each other. And then from there on out, we've been kind of working together, going down this path together to make sure we're supporting our young men. So that's kind of how we came together.
And I think it was about how can we change practice to be equitable across the board in regard to discipline. How can we do that? How can we do that differently? And how can we bring our teachers along that journey? It starts, that foundation is in the classroom and working with our staff to, I guess, engage our teachers differently and our parents.
All right, so you guys gotta bear with me. I'm a licensed counselor. I like touchy-feely stuff sometimes. So if you guys can play along and close your eyes for a second. I want you to close your eyes for a second. So we have Robert, a third grade student in Minneapolis public schools. He's reading at grade level. Actually, he's reading at the, I think it's the N grade level, the N book. He hasn't been sent out of class, no suspensions. His parents are involved in his education, right? They may not make it to all parent-teacher conferences, but they set aside a time at home for him to be able to do his work and complete his work. Then we have Sean, a 7th grade student in Minneapolis public schools. He's already taken algebra as a 7th grader. He's part of the student council. He's the treasurer for the student council. He's really good at sports, so he plays sports as well. He also has never been suspended, nor does he have any referrals out of class. Then we have Marcus, 12th grade student in Minneapolis public schools. Senior. Great, he's almost out of here, right? He's almost graduating. He has 12 credits already for college as a senior in high school from taking PSEO or IB or advanced coursework. He's also part of student government. He's the vice president of the school. And then he has 3 scholarships already signed. 2 to historically black college, Grambling and Jackson State, and then 1 to the University of Minnesota. You guys can open your eyes. The reason why I have you guys do that activity is that those are stories that are going on in Minneapolis public schools, but those are not the stories that are shared about our black males. All too often we hear the negative data that's being shared about our black males, and that's not what I want to share when I'm in spaces like this. I'm very particular about the data that I share about our young men, because when you walk out of this space, if all you heard was negative data, when you encounter one of our young black men, you'll see them as a deficit. And we have to look at our young men as assets, because they are assets. So I just want to make sure that you understand kind of the work that I'll be doing and how I approach it is all of our young men are assets, and we need to be looking at it that way. So data, I know it's important, I know everybody wants to hear it, but we have to be careful with where we share that data. Our young men are watching TV, our young men are reading newspapers, and so they see this data all the time. And so we're putting a perception in their mind of who they are. And so it's important that we as adults change that narrative. How do we get that positive information out there to them so that they can understand who they really are and what they're capable of versus some of that negative information that's out there.
So we're going to back up just a little bit before we move forward, and just where the policy started. Where did behavior standards start, and why did we have to create a new behavior policy for our students and families and our staff in Minneapolis? Did we have issues? It's like any school district. This is a national issue where we look at that disproportionality and wonder why are we suspending our young black males at a higher rate than anyone else. So we had to look at a policy that established a graduated level system for how we work with our students. We had to think of a new way, or we had to come up with a new way to work with our students. And that's that emphasis on teaching our students what to do instead of what not to do. I tell my son what not to do all the time. don't do that, don't do this. But I never say, you know what, son, I need you to do this. This is how I need you to behave. This is how I need you to react to something. Those are the pieces that we want to embed in our daily practice as teachers. And then the use of restorative practices is where we get that emphasis on what to do instead of what not to do. We want our teachers to be able to develop relationships with our students, and we want those relationships to help guide and structure kind of how those classrooms are led. And what I mean by that is we want our students to feel safe in those classrooms, feel cared about, and feel like that teacher wants them to be there. And that's all a part of that foundational building relationships with students. And then we really want to be careful in terms of removing them from that instructional setting. We want everything done before that would occur. We want that to be the very last step in a process. So we want there to be interventions in place before that removal would happen. And kind of to speak to what Michael spoke to earlier in terms of visiting with the young black males, they give us ideas. Their voice needs to be at the table for some of this work, and they're very instrumental in how we are moving forward because they're listening to their experience and their journey within the system. So the big work was done kind of prior to me coming on board, and that was in June. They had this huge professional development session where there were teams from each school in the district, and they were probably about 6 to 8 folks on those teams, and those teams started the work. Within each school, they had to come up with a plan that was a positive school-wide engagement plan, and this plan was to focus on positive school-wide behavior, and there were 9 different components of these plans. They had to put in place pre-intervention systems, they had to talk about how they would use restorative practice in their building, as well as creating the members of the team, kind of assigning different duties to those team members, and also commit to looking at the data in their building regularly. We also had to engage and support the other staff members. So this set of 6 to 8 folks per building would train, support, and engage the other staff members in the building. So they had a big job. And also that regularly review data. That's on a weekly to bi-weekly basis that we're expecting that to happen, because within my team, we go out and we meet with schools. We go out and do building visits, and we look at that plan, and we ask where areas of weakness are, we ask where areas of strength are, and we like to highlight those during our principal meetings or during any opportunity we get to do that. So again, that district support for this work included myself, and then there's 2 other team members. I have a restorative practice coordinator who helps do professional development in different buildings in terms of that restorative practice tool. And then we are bringing on board tomorrow, actually, our 3rd team member, a positive behavior coordinator. And they will help look and guide plans in terms of how do we support our students who are behaving on a regular basis. That was one of the biggest pieces that we heard from our students. What about the students that are behaving regularly? Can we get some kind of incentive or reward for that? Well, let's look at that. How can we frame a whole school positive engagement session? What if we have an assembly? I mean, there are lots of different ideas that our students gave, but we really wanted to focus on that student voice. Again, the professional development piece. We started aligning our professional development to ensure that we're giving teachers the tools. As I have said a little bit earlier, and I will continue to say this throughout, we have to give our teachers the tools to work with all of our students. And then coaching, so we kind of tailored it to different buildings. Each school in our district is so different. So that's why we visit each school and we look at their plan. Some schools may need a little bit more restorative practice training. Some schools may need some help with coming up with those pre-interventions before students, giving them a set of specific interventions before students are removed from that classroom. So we really want to make sure these pieces are embedded in our practice and they're embedded in what we do every day in our buildings. And then the community agency support. We have a lot of support around restorative practices. Our Legal Rights Center in Minneapolis, they work with us to ensure that we can get staff to go out to buildings and do that professional development piece. Buildings are asking for it. They want the change. They want to do things differently, and we have to be able to provide those tools. And we also have mental health-based supports in some of our school sites. They have on-site support. Some have full-time mental health support. Some have a portion of the day where they're offered mental health support. But it's kind of that wraparound piece. How do we support and meet the needs of the whole child? I know you might have to take the clicker from me today, huh?
No, you're good.
Oh, yeah.
So, starting about the work for the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. Again, we started in August, and so this is something that is brand new. There's really no blueprint. We're kind of creating it from the ground up. And so I wanted to make sure that I got the input of key stakeholders. So I had to present to the board. I started August 1st. I think my presentation to the board was August 12th. So it's like 2 weeks in of what are you going to do, Michael Walker? How are you going to make this work? And just so we are all clear, I don't have all the answers, and I understand that, right? It's going to take a community of people to bring this effort together. It's going to take many different people, many different partners to make sure that we're working together to ensure that our young men are being successful. So I want to start off with that piece. So I came with a plan to the board of what I'm going to do on my first 100 days. And that 100 days was about engaging with key stakeholders. And I viewed those key stakeholders being community members, parents and families, educators, and then also the young black men themselves. In order to have something that's successful, that's sustainable, you have to make sure you get the buy-in from those different groups, right? If you just go out and sit in my office and start creating programs and initiatives on my own, I didn't get any input from anybody. It was just all that was in Michael Walker's head, and it's easy for it to be a disaster that way. And so I didn't want our office to start off in that manner. I wanted our office to make sure that we got input, that we got the voice of the people we're trying to impact, right? And so that's what I went out and did. So my first 100 days was out engagement. And I did it a little differently. In Minneapolis, we need to do things different. We got to connect with our community in a totally different way. We have been doing the same things over and over again, and we're getting those same results. So how do we get different results? You have to try some new stuff, right? And so that's what I started out doing. So I'm going to try some new things in this office. So one way I did engagement was my first time going out to the community. I went to barbershops and hair salons. And people may laugh and say, why did you do that? Or why would you do that? Well, if you know about the black community, there's a lot of conversation that goes on in barbershops and hair salons. And the key component about that is it's uncut, raw, and it's truth, right? And in order for us to change in Minneapolis public schools, we have to hear that truth so that we can make the necessary changes. If we don't hear the truth and everything we hear is sugar-coated, then we're going to continue to do the same things over and over again. So I went out to the spaces where I knew the people were, and those are sometimes the people that we are not engaging in our schools, right? They're not necessarily coming to the parent-teacher conference. They're not coming to those town hall type meetings. So how do we get out of our comfort zone and go into those spaces where they are so they can voice their concerns, voice their opinions? And so I want to make sure that we did that. And so that was one of the tools that I used to do that. The other piece is that when I would do community events, because you have to do community events and whatnot, right? So I went to these community events, but I didn't have a table like traditional setup, right? Most times you have a table with your banner, flyers, brochures. I said, nah, that's not gonna work for me. So what I decided to do is I had my little backpack on, had my little iPad or notepad, and I just went around and engaged with people at these different events, family members, adults, community members, and just asked them simple questions about their experience in Minneapolis public schools, whether they were students, or whether they had students in our system, or whether they were parents or community members. Just what's your experience and what's your perception of Minneapolis public schools, because we need all of that information. So again, I want to make sure we were giving voice to the people that didn't necessarily feel like they had a voice before in this process. So that's what my huge deal was. Also, I did internal stuff. I went and met with educators, right? They're the people who are connecting with our students every single day. And I guess I'll back up. When I say educators, I'm talking about the whole gamut. I'm talking about board members, district level staff, administrators, teachers, support staff, social workers, counselors, custodians, food service people. We need to hear all of their voices because they're having contact with our students every single day. So how are we making sure they are all on the same page and we're all on the same page to make a difference? So it's important that we get those voices in the space.
You gonna talk about the boys?
Yeah, I'll talk about the boys. Okay. So the real joy of my job, I love the young men, right? So love going out with the young men. So I made it a point that I was going to go out and talk to these young men. And so I went to all 7 of the high schools, including Harrison, and also went to 4 or 5 middle schools. Mm-hmm. So went out, and over that time we met with about 200 and something young men. And I basically had these 5 questions that I was asking the young people as well as the adults. And those questions, I'm gonna try to remember them, were: what has led to your success currently? What are some obstacles you face in Minneapolis public schools? Who or what has influence over you? Now that you know this office exists, how can this office be of support for you? And then this was really for the young men. I told them that I work for you. So at the end of the year, how will you give me a grade? How will you give me a letter grade of an A, so that I understand that I work for you? I'm your spokesperson, and so I want to make sure that I'm hearing what you have to say so that I'm making that change. And so I would ask them that question: how do I earn an A from you? And so they would tell me those different things. And one school, well, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, and those are some of the visits that I went on with Michael, and I have to say that drives the work that we do every day, hearing their voices and hearing their experiences. I think you need to share that one.
At which one?
About the bus.
Oh, about the bus, yeah. Is it on the next slide, I think?
Oh, look at that, see?
Story of the Young Kings. So we were at one of the sites, and a young man was telling me a story, and well, his statement was, no matter where we at, we're looked at as monsters. That's what the young man stated to me, and me being a counselor, right? Can you tell me more about that? And so he started to tell a story, and so his story started was, he said, me and a couple of my friends were leaving school, getting ready to catch the bus back home. In Minneapolis, the high school students all have the Metro Transit bus pass, so they can catch public transportation. So him and a couple of his other black male friends were going to the bus stop. And it was kind of windy this day, he said. And he said, so they was walking into the bus shelter, and there was a white female sitting on the bench inside the bus shelter. And she got up and walked out of the shelter as those 3 young men walked in. And the young man said, she didn't say anything to us, but the fact that she got up and walked out made me feel some type of way. And as he was saying that, another student in the back corner stood up and said, man, you should have knocked her out. That's what he said. And I stopped and said, well, that's not what we're here to talk about. That's not what it's about. But as I reflected on that, it made me think that whatever we expect from our students, that's what they will give us. Now, what if the lady that was sitting there would say, hey, how you guys doing today? How was your day? Yeah, it is cold out there. Why don't you come in here and get out of that wind? How would that conversation would have went, right? It could have been totally different. So it's all about our perceptions as adults. How do we perceive our young people? What are our biases towards our young people? And so we have to make sure that we are aware of that, so those things don't creep into our classroom and have us treating students differently. So.
And I think to speak to that just a little more, I have a son, and for me, that broke my heart. That's their journey in the Minneapolis school districts. There were some other comments that were brought forward. And then some of the pieces or the visits that I went on is where we talked about those double standards of behavior. They may engage differently with another classmate, and they may get a different consequence than their fellow white classmate or their fellow Asian classmate. And how does that impact them? Are they just coming to school with that thought process that we're going to get in trouble anyway? So that drives the work that we do.
I think we might want to go back, because I don't know if I was finished on that slide. Oh. Are you telling me I have to be done? So I talked about the second phase was after doing that 100-day research. I figured out that we had a system of broken beliefs, right? And it was from all different parts of it, and I'll talk more about the broken beliefs part later. But what I ended up doing was doing some research internally. I did some research in the community, and then also did some research outside of our district. There's another office for African American males. It's out in Oakland, California, and they've been in existence for 5 years. And so I've been talking to him, actually went out and visited with him to learn from what they're doing with their young black men out there in Oakland. So it was a good learning experience, but there's a lot of work to do and a lot more we need to be doing here in Minneapolis. So just want to make sure I said that. So this is where the broken beliefs come into play. So with all of that, we designed a framework for the office. And I don't know if I can see that close. I might have to back up here. So if you see, it has the key stakeholders that are part of this belief framework. And if you look at the outside, it says what? Black male students need to believe in themselves, parents need to believe in the teachers, community must believe in a collective system, and then educators need to believe in black male students, right? And so in order for this entire thing to work, we all have to be in alignment with that. We all have to be in alignment with that, and we all have to believe and trust the other parts are doing their job. I'm a basketball player, I'm a coach, and so to me it's important to understand roles, right? As a basketball coach, I know my point guard is responsible for certain things, and that's what I hold him responsible for, right? And then my center is held for different responsibilities. And so what I'm trying to get at with this framework is saying that as a school system, we are responsible for this, and that is our area, and that's what we need to focus on, and we need to be really good at delivering that, right? And then parents are responsible for a different part of it, and the students are responsible for a certain part, as well as the community, right? And we have to trust that each other are doing their parts to the best of their ability and not start to point fingers, because once you start pointing fingers, that's where dissension comes in, and then that's where the whole system is not successful, right? And so that's kind of how we're coming with this framework. I know it's kind of light, but if you look under each, let's go to parents, it says we want educators are fair-minded and equitable. That's what we want that belief statement to be. We want educators to be fair-minded and equitable. We want the parents to believe that educators are fair-minded and equitable when it comes to their students, right? Right now, we know that that's not necessarily the case, because when you look at our data, it doesn't prove that, right? For the community, you want community to believe that there's a system is educating all of our students. You want the community to believe that the system is educating all of our students. But again, when you look at our data, it kind of goes against that right now. For our teachers, we want them to believe that young black men are motivated to learn. They have to believe that our young black men are motivated to learn. And then for the black males themselves, they have to believe that they can see academic success in their future. So it's all responsibility on each part, and they have to own that box, right? If you look at the different boxes, there's a growth mindset in each one of those, right? Because in order for us to move forward, we have to understand that it's going to take a different type of mindset, and we have to understand that you can grow, right? Intelligence is not something that you are. You can become intelligent, right? You can learn it. You can work on it to be better at it. So that's kind of how we're focusing on that. And as we're talking about it, I know this form is called the Achievement Gap form, right? I don't sign on to that. I'll just be upfront. I don't sign on with that. As I'm out talking to our young people in the schools, they're telling me all types of ways that they're achieving in different aspects and parts of their life, right? So it's not the fact that they can't achieve. That's not what it is. It's about us as adults. What do we believe they can do? Do we believe they can achieve? We have to focus on that. And so some of this is internally for ourselves. How do we look at our own implicit biases when we're dealing with our young people? And so I just want to make sure that that's clear, that I don't sign on to the achievement gap, because I know the young men can achieve. I've seen it happen. We'll get to questions later. I've seen it happen. I've seen it work. And I believe that these young men will be successful. As we keep going in the boxes, we can go with educators. We want to make sure that they have the tools to be successful, as Robin Francis talked about, providing that professional development for our educators. So we want to make sure that our lesson plans are culturally relevant, our curriculum is culturally relevant, right? That we're building community inside of our classrooms. That's really important, building those relationships. You know, and it's important about our curriculum as well. What are we putting in front of our students? You know, people always talk about you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? And when I think about that, as far as relates to education, it makes me ask two questions. What have I done to make the horse thirsty? And then what type of water am I trying to get them to drink? And if you kind of put different people in those spaces, you put this child, and I'm not trying to say they're a horse, but the child is that horse, right? The adult is, what have I done? The adult is leading that child to the water. So what have I done to make that young person thirsty for the knowledge, which is the water, right? Sometimes the water that we're giving them is polluted, right? I'm not gonna drink that. So we gotta make sure that the information that we're giving our students is valuable, that it's important, that it makes sense to them, that it's relevant to them, that they can see themselves in it, right? We have to make sure that that's happening in our classrooms. So that's some things that we have to change as adults. How do we figure that piece out? How do we incorporate that into our lesson planning? So again, we talk about the young men, want them to be motivated, have that self-worth, self-identity. When I was out doing these conversations, these are not their words, but kind of their thoughts, is that they didn't know who they were, where they come from, what their history was. All they knew about their history was from 1619, which is around slavery, right? And so that's all that they learn about themselves. They don't know about the past before 1619, how that impacts who they are and where they come from. And so we have to change that so they can understand to see themselves in positive ways, not as a slave. That's the only thing you know about yourself. Why do you think you can achieve anything else, right? So we have to be real deliberate about what we're showing our students. And then also with our parents. We want our parents to be empowered. They're the first teacher of our students, of their kids. And we have to know that and value that as educators, right? We have to look at them as partners in this, not as someone against us. We have to look at them as partners in this, because we have to make sure that they understand their role, their responsibility. But as we talk about parents, we have to, again, going back to Mrs. Francis's department, our disproportionality of suspensions. That's not something that just happened last year or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. That's been going on for 25, 30, 100 years, right? We just now have named it and actually started collecting the data on it. But if we start to think about it, our parents were the recipients of those same discipline practices, right? They were suspended, they were expelled, they were referred out of class, right? And I'm not saying that I'm an expert on trauma, because I'm not, but they may have had a traumatic school experience, right? And from my role as an assistant principal, I've seen how that has played out in a couple different ways. One way is that what we typically see and we get frustrated with is maybe a parent is not showing up at our schools, right? Maybe they're not answering some of the phone calls that we call home. Maybe they're not coming to parent-teacher conferences, right? And then the second way they come in, maybe they come in there and so upset and they're yelling and screaming, right, to get their point across, because they didn't have any power when they were students. They want to make sure they have power now, so they're going to display it in that way. But the issue that I have with both of those scenarios is the little babies that we're working with, they never get their needs met, right? They never get their needs met. And we have to own some of that as a school system. We created this reality for some of our parents. So how do we step back and take some of that, right? So as an assistant principal, there's been many times that parents have come up to the school and have gotten on me. But I take them to my office and I let them sit down and then they vent. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 10 minutes, sometimes it's 15 minutes, right? But we have to give them that space to vent. And then after that venting, I say, okay, I'm sorry for what happened to you in Minneapolis public schools, right?
And I
But
think,
now I'm sorry.
and I think it's about exactly that. We have to teach our staff, we have to teach our teachers, we have to share with them that some folks have had a different journey in our system. So how do we teach them to be appreciative of that and still be able to move on and get what we need done for our students done?
I'll stop my story. That's what you're telling me I need to stop my story. I can get to talking forever. So anyway, we just got to make sure that we take on some of that responsibility, allow our parents to have a space to be able to vent a little bit so that we can actually hear them. But it may take time, and we don't need to shut them down, because sometimes when they vent, we don't want to communicate with them anymore, or we start to walk away from them, and then we just put up another wall, right? So now they don't trust us again. So we have to figure out a different way to engage and get our families to trust us. Okay, I'm sorry.
And I wanted to speak before you speak about Black. When you shared about putting that positive narrative out there, sharing those more positive stories, I think that's really important to say also with this piece. But we're very laser focused and we're very intentional about how we bring the support forward. So it's creating those narratives ourselves now, making sure there are more of those narratives to share, those positive pieces of those student experiences that are happening in schools. So.
And before I get into this, I'll just talk about, so after doing all that information, we came up with 3 big bucket areas that we want to work on in the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. Professional development for educators, authentically engaging our community and families, and then working with our young black males directly. And so when we talk about professional development, the first thing we want to do is talk about how do we look at our own internal implicit biases and how that impacts how we teach our students. And so we want to do some type of training around that. Some of the other things that we want to do to make it systemic is that we want to try, and what we're working on right now is how do we infuse some culturally relevant PD that has to be a part of the tenure process for teachers. So before you become tenured in our district, you have to complete such and such amount of culturally relevant PD. Now that's not decided, but that's what I'm working towards. That's what I want to work on and focus on. So that's kind of the area that we're looking at for that PD. We talk about authentically engaging our families. You kind of heard me talking about doing things differently, right? We have to go into the spaces where our communities are. And Robin talked about how we were doing different events, right? And this is just district-wide. We're doing different events, and we expect parents and families to come out to this event on Tuesday. Then we have another event on Wednesday, and then we have another event next week on Friday, right? That's a whole lot that we're asking our parents to do. And so how do we internally start to become succinct and making sure that we provide one opportunity for our parents to be able to come to these events and get the information that they need versus asking them to come to 4, 5, 6 different events, right, throughout the course of a month. And so we're collaborating for an event. I'm not going to say the date because I don't remember, but an event together from her office and my office so that we can get more families there, and so it's more beneficial, right? And we're also partnering with
MMEP and Pillsbury United to make sure that we are embedding how we do family engagement differently. These are folks that already have community support, so why not us come to them this time? Let's come to our families and meet at the table so we can figure out a better way to get more parents involved. I think more often than not, as Michael said, we ask our parents to come to the school district or the school district building or come to a school building. Why not go to the families? Let's have dinner, let's have a conversation. Our last meeting we had youth facilitators facilitate the discussion around kind of that behavior standards piece and what looks different and how can we get that parent-student voice at the table now. So we had youth facilitators at all the tables, and they actually did the report out from their tables about the different things that parents were seeing in regard to the behavior standards policy. So it's just, again, as we have kind of throughout the presentation, we can't keep doing things the same. We have to do something differently.
Yeah. So the last part of it is working with our young men directly. And so, as you can see, the title of the program, class that we're developing is called BLACK. And it stands for Building Lives, Acquiring Cultural Knowledge. And that just happened to come to me and it made sense, so we're gonna use it, right? We're gonna go with that, right? Perfect, makes sense. But I'm really intentional about using the word black. As you see, kind of our PowerPoint presentation has a black background. We have to start looking at black as a positive and not as a negative. Again, that's about how society has trained us to think that that word is negative. And so I want to change that narrative for that word, for those young men, right? And so being very intentional. Now, if you look at the acronym, Building Lives, Acquiring Cultural Knowledge, that could be for any group, right? It could be for any group. So it's not just for black males. Right now, we're focusing, being laser focused on our black males, but hopefully we can transfer this into other groups that are also being marginalized in our system so that they can have that support. So when we look at black, there's kind of 3 components that I'm focusing on when we're doing the program. Mentorship, leadership development, service learning. Now, I have my own spin on all of those, so I'll explain them to you why. But mentorship is really important. As we all know, you need someone that can take you through from step by step of how to get through the process, right? It's really important that we make sure that someone is there that can teach us, walk us down that road and path, and someone that we can kind of bounce ideas off of. So that's very important. But another piece to that is I want to make sure that our young men are mentors themselves, right? I want to build that responsibility in them so that they understand they have responsibility for the next generation that's coming along. So our high school students will mentor our middle school students, who will then mentor elementary school students. So that's kind of what we're working on to get at. The other piece about mentorship is we hear this term role models, right? You guys all hear the term role models? And I'm just going to say it right now, so don't hurt me. I hate that term. And the reason why I don't like that term is when you think about role models, it's usually, or our kids, when they have role models, usually some person that they can't touch, right? It's usually an athlete, an entertainer, someone that they can't get access to. And so what I want to put in front of our students are real models. So I use the term real models because it's real people that I can touch every day, like, hey, how you doing, right? I see you go to work every single day. I see you taking care of your family. How do we show that to our students so they understand how to be a man, right? How to be connected to their community, how to develop people they can see at the grocery store, people they see in their schools, people they see at their churches, right? Making sure that we putting those real models in front of our students so they understand what it's like to be a real man and not these characters that are on TV and these fake people that they show us, right? Because we don't know who they really are. We just know that's the character that they show us on TV. The second component, leadership development. And I'll just speak from my own personal experience on this one, is that when I was a student, I was never involved in any type of like student council or student government when I was in high school. No one tapped me to be a part of that, right? And so that's troubling for me because now I'm in this role and I've never had a chance to practice on making tough decisions, having a budget that I'm responsible for. And so if you don't have an opportunity to practice, when you almost, or you're about to fail, right? You don't know if I'm gonna be okay if I fail, if I'm not gonna be okay. And so our young men need to get that practice. So how do we intentionally select them to be in leadership positions? How do we make sure that we're seeking them out to be on different boards and committees? in our communities, in our schools, right? Because once we do that, then they have more buy-in to that school or to that community or to that program. And now they also understand that their voice counts and their voice matters. And they have some things to bring to the table. So we have to be deliberate, intentional about how we're connecting with our young black males, right? And so that's something I want to focus on. And I also want to give them the tools to be successful, right? I'm not just saying put them in these roles and let them be willy-nilly out there. No, how do we give them the skills to be successful? Because we know being in those leadership roles, you learn teamwork, you learn organizational skills, right? All those things are going to help you become a successful person in society. The last piece, service learning. And it's just going to say it. That's about, to me, black men are always the recipients of something, right? Case in point, this office. They need this, they need that. And sometimes that gives you an inferiority complex, right? I'm always in need of something. So I want to do service learning projects so the young men can get some confidence in themselves and know that they have attributes, they have skills, and that society needs to value what they bring to the table, right? So how do we do that and show that? So if we're out in the community doing some good work, people can see that and recognize that. You know, this is not just a Minneapolis school district deal, right? This is a community deal. This is a media deal. The media kind of runs a lot of the information that we see. And so how do we change that narrative? How do we change those perceptions, those videos, those images that they're putting out there of our young black men? And so it's important to me that I try to accomplish that as well with some of the work that we're doing, because that's important, because that's what people see, and then that's how those beliefs and those implicit biases get inside of us because of the information that we're seeing. Those are kind of three of the big pillars of the program. The other piece to the program is that I want them to be able to answer 5 questions. Who am I? Who am I? Who are we? What is our current state? Where am I going and how do I get there? And then once I'm there, how do I stay and or advance, right? Those are questions that you need to be asking yourself on a daily basis to make sure that you're on the right path, you're on the right road, right? Who am I? Who are we? What is our current state? Where am I going and how do I get there? And then once I'm there, how do I stay and or advance? Again, I'll just speak to my own truth. First person in my family to graduate from college. And I'm talking about cousins, aunts, second cousins, right? First one. I had no one in those spaces to be able to help me navigate through those systems, right? When I became in the educational field and became an assistant principal, I didn't have an uncle or a brother, anybody to call and say, hey, what is it like to be an assistant principal? I had to figure all those things out by myself. So it's important that we create this network for our young men so they have people they can connect with to be able to ask those questions in those safe spaces so they can be successful. So I don't know, that's...
Okay, so did you guys know he's the shy one between the two of us? He always says that. I just had to point that out. We always have a conversation before we present. And I think that's so funny that I have to like stop him.
I'm very shy.
So to kind of sum up, this has kind of been the reoccurring theme throughout. We have to do something different. We can't keep doing the same thing, expecting different results. So that's where we are. Again, as Michael said, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying something different to get some different results. So I think that, again, I talked about restorative practice a bit, and that's a relational-based practice. And it's really getting at how do we help our students work with adults, how do we support them in working with adults, and how do we teach our adults to work with our kids. I mean, one of the things that we did recently was we had an annual student forum where we asked students specific questions. And some of the questions that came back from our students, and we asked them questions around behavior standards and the policy and what they thought about it. One of them was, are you training your teachers as much as you're training us? And I think that's an important piece to hear. So it is. It's about giving our teachers the tools to work with all of our kids. And it is about relationship-based practice.
And just from our office, in particular for Office of Black Male Student Achievement, we have a person that works on our professional development, and she's been working with our PAR mentors and our instructional specialists around how to do some culturally relevant lesson planning with those folks who can touch other teachers, right? We're only one office, there's only 3 people in our office, and so we're trying to figure out how do we get the biggest impact. So we have about 25 PAR mentors in our district who works with our first through third year teachers, and we have another 50-something ISs, instructional specialists, who works with a portion of our teachers. And so what our department is doing is partnering with those departments, teaching them, or PD, giving them some professional development around culturally relevant lesson planning so they can go out and impact the teachers that are in the buildings around making sure that lesson plans are culturally relevant. Yes, we're trying to be in all sorts of spaces. So we have had meetings with Gen Next. I've actually been on a couple of their committees. The one committee that I was on is the high school graduation committee, so I'm at the table for that conversation. But again, as I talked about the first 100 days, probably whatever day I'm in now, 175 or so, we are constantly meeting with community organizations to learn about the work that they're doing out in the communities. Because again, we only can do so much inside of our buildings, right? And so we got to make sure that we're partnering with the other agencies who have the connections with the families, who have the connections with the students, and then how do we bring that together? And so it's not about me knowing everything, but how can I be a conduit saying, okay, you can come here and then I can put you to this organization that has this resource for you, or this is another program that you can be working with. So just trying to figure out what are all those players out there and then what resources they have for our students and families.
That's all a part of training our teachers, training them to engage our students differently. It's training them in all the different aspects of working with all of our kids, and with a pretty intense focus on our African American males, but all of our students. So all those different pieces of movement, we have some different ways that we incorporate that, social emotional learning. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can look at it, but to me, best practice, or in reflection of best practice, it's engaging all of our students, and there are different ways to do that with the different ways to reach our students. So it might be movement for some, it might be a video for another, and it's having those different aspects built into our daily practice. Did you want to say?
I could add a little bit to that. So, the other piece about that is knowing who our students are. And as we talk about building relationships, we have to know what drives and what motivates our students so that we can make that curriculum relevant to the students that are sitting in front of us. And so we are talking to our teachers about how do you connect with your students to find out who they are and how do you make that lesson come to them, right? How do you make it come to them? The other piece that we're doing is for our PD, we have a couple things. We have a collaborative action research cohorts that we have in our schools, and it's around positive student engagement, specifically for Black males. And so teachers are reading a couple books, one by Pedro Nagero, the other by Dr. Juwanza Kunjufu, about how to engage our Black male students. And through this process, they'll have a research question, then they'll try some of those best practice strategies in the classroom, and if they work, they'll be great. If they don't work, we need to know that information, right? And so at the end of the summer, June,
Yep,
I want to say we have a
workshop where they will present at our positive school-wide engagement session. So there's a 2-day workshop where there'll be those groups that did the research and did the practice will come bring that work forward.
And share that information so that we know if we're doing things that we shouldn't be doing, let's stop doing those right now and then increase the things that we see that are working, right? Teachers are coaches, and sometimes we got to make sure that we stress that to our teachers, that they're coaching our students. And that's a tough question to answer, mainly because to me that's what it is, right? Teaching is coaching, so I don't know how to separate the two. And so I think we got to make sure that our teachers understand that and buy into that theory as well. But I think it's the same thing.
Well, I think when we do train teachers, we do look at best practice and a way to engage all of our students. So those are absolutely things we take into consideration when bringing forward professional development. We're really being planful in terms of how we roll out our professional development. We are, instead of kind of making it one-stop shops, they're more a continuation of the learning. So it's not just, okay, here's a little session on restorative practice, and now you won't see that again. We're digging deeper. So our second summer session, which is what Michael talked about just a moment ago in regard to that collaborative action research, So we had this year of behavior standards. We had initial training. So now it's time to dig deeper into that training and look at the different ways to engage students. Look at bringing forward those folks to do those presentations, and look at maybe restorative practice and intensive session. Now that you have those informal practices down in regard to restorative practice, what are some other ways that we can reach out and do some deeper digging with that work? So that speaks to in terms of the engagement of the initial part of the question. And then the bullying piece within my department, there are folks that work specifically with bullying. We have training videos. We incorporate that into especially our initial work, and then that is also tied into the behavior standards piece, looking at specific consequences within the menu of behavior standards. We absolutely know we need to embed equity work. It shouldn't be a standalone. That should be embedded into our practice daily. And then the piece in regard to our policy, we knew we had to create a different policy. We knew what we had before wasn't working. But the important pieces that we might have left out initially were some of that student voice and our parent voice. So we were able to do some capturing of that. For me, it'll be an ever-changing document into how we support this work. We heard some very interesting things from our students, and not necessarily interesting, but very informative pieces of change that we can make within our current behavior standards policy. They live it and breathe it every day. We also heard some good things from our staff on some things that we can change, and we also plan to have a team to work through some of that to make sure that we are making changes in the best interests of our students and our staff and our families. Because it's equitable for all of our students. And it's a menu of supports that doesn't say a one-size-fits-all. What it says is, look at the student, look at the situation, here are some options in terms of consequences. Make sure that you're following those pieces, but it's equitable practice across the board.
And then also talk about what you guys just did last week. Every school had to hear the voices of the students.
So, yep, we did I spoke to this a little bit earlier. We did a student annual forum where every single building in our district had to make sure that they asked each of their students these 3 specific questions surrounding the policy. And one of the questions within that was, what do we need to change? Is there something that we need to change? Are there suggestions that you have? And what is going well? What can we build upon? So we hear those student voices and we bring that forward. We're also creating groups to help evaluate the policy in terms of, okay, now we have all this information from our students. What do we do with that? So we're bringing it to our kind of a youth evaluatory group that will help support and help bring those to an adult team that will meet and talk through the change.
I mean, I think that goes with scalability, how you scale different programs and different opportunities for students and for our teachers. So I think we're working on that piece as a huge system. And I'll just, like I said, be honest, when I came from the building level, going to the district level, you don't understand how big our system is until you get into that district level and say, oh my goodness, we have 60 plus buildings in our district. How do I make sure what I'm doing is going to be sufficient in this site as well as this site as well as this site when there's different demographics, different needs? And so I think that's some of the struggle with having a district so big, is that we have different buildings and different needs, and so we have to be responsive to those needs of the different buildings. So I think that was probably some of the struggle, scaling it. And we didn't have any specific offices responsible for those things, but now that we have an office, we can kind of take some of those ideas and see how we can move those out into other buildings, because we are doing some of that, looking at best practices at some of our internal schools and how we can transfer those over to other sites.
And when we look at the data at buildings, those buildings that have red flags in terms of high amounts of suspensions for whatever group, we go address them. Our team of 3, our team of 2, we go to those buildings and we work with them and say, how can we support? What do you need? What's going on? Let's look at the data. Let's look at your practice. So we're very focused in terms of being able to look at that data and then address the issue.
I was just going to say that's a big question, and we have to remember that our offices are brand new, so we don't have everything figured out. So some of the questions you're asking Like, we're still in the developmental stages of how we're going to get to some of these spaces, but that is definitely on our radar. I've definitely had conversation with a person in our department, or not in our department, but in our district, who work with our homeless and highly mobile students. So we are having those conversations, those dialogues to try to get to some resolutions with those groups.
But I also think there are buildings that do have good practices in place to have almost some wraparound services for those new students that come in. So it's a matter of modeling those practices or modeling those processes that are already in place in our other schools.